March 25, 1911, a deadly fire broke out in the Triangle Shirtwaist factory of New York City, killing 146 innocent people. The disaster started when a small fire broke out in a rag bin, which ultimately led to the 10-story factory breaking out into vicious flames. The building lacked proper safety regulations to deal with the disaster, and employees had zero preparation for the catastrophe they faced. The employees were also faced with poorly made fire escapes, broken elevators, and locked doors. This event led to massive attention regarding the need for changes within the urban labor system, specifically regarding conditions of factories. This event also marked a significant turning point in both the Gilded Age and efforts of the Progressive Era, as the event exposed a massive flaw within the progressive goal to improve labor conditions within the cities. The event, and others of the same type, showed how the progressive efforts did not fully apply to cities and the everyday laborer. Additionally, the lack of safety regulations within the factory was exposed to all, and people started to become aware of other massive issues, including child labor, animal-like treatment of workers, and the various hardships of factory life. This event informed society on these issues and spurred the formation of various reforms to solve these problems.
The fire affected the lives of many, not just the victims. Hundreds of workers within the factory were forced to see their friends and family be burned alive or jump hundreds of feet to their death. The event was scaring yet an eye-opening experience. Mary Domsky-Abrams, a blouse operator, describes her experience. In the confusion, I watched the fire and saw how the rescue operation was conducted under conditions of panic. Flames poured through the windows of the top floors and thick smoke billowed. How I got to 18 Rutgers Street, where I lived, I'll never know. But I do remember coming into the house and screamingly asking whether my friend Netta had arrived. They told me she hadn't. So I ran back to the fire site, but by that time the authorities didn't let anyone get close. I saw that, beside the ambulances, they were bringing caskets.
Conditions within the factory proved to be brutal and demoralizing. Women worked 13 hours every day, only earning $6 a week. The workers often had to pay for their needles and thread to make the shirtwaist. The factory owners would also mess with the clocks during the workday, moving them forward during lunch or covering them at the end of the day in order to gain more working time from the women. There were also strict rules put in place by the bosses, like no talking or making noise. If this rule was violated, the worker had to pay a fine. The structural conditions of the factory were highly unsanitary, and the safety regulations were also very poor. The fire escapes were extremely narrow and would have taken hours to climb down. There was only one elevator, which was difficult to reach, and the stairways leading to the street were locked by the owners in order to prevent stealing. It is easy to make the connection between these fatal conditions of the factory and their role on the day of the fire. Since the doors were locked by the owners and the fire escapes were inefficient, many women's only option was jumping out of windows, a horrific sight for the public down below to see. 146 workers' deaths was the result of the intense desire of Blank and Harris, the owners of the factory, to make a profit and no interference from the government to prevent them from going to these excessive measures to do so.
Adults were not the only victims of this catastrophe, as the majority of deaths proved to be children around the age of 15 or 16. Children were often hired to work the looms because they were small enough to reach the intricate parts of the machine and could be paid much less than the adult workers. In the early 1900s, the amount of child laborers reached its height, having 18% of all American workers being under the age of 16. The fire brought massive attention to this issue as the harsh conditions these children faced within the factory became truly exposed. Soon after this, the United States took action to change this destructive labor system. In New York, bills were passed after the fire in 1912, 1913, and 1914 to greatly reduce and reshape the system of child labor, creating limits on age and hours worked. In 1938, Congress passed the Fair Labor Standards Act, fixing minimum ages of 16 for work during school hours, 14 for certain jobs after school, and 18 for dangerous work. Clearly, without the tragic events of the fire affecting so many young workers, the increase of attention towards child labor would not have happened, leaving the cycle of poverty and hardship with children for many more years.
The people of New York were outraged by the fire, and workers all around the city joined together to get better conditions and regulations within the factory. The state of New York created a Factory Investigation Commission, which examined the safety and working conditions in New York factories. The commission found many issues in factories all over the state, similar to those causes of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. The commission made recommendations to the state, and over the next 3 years, about 36 laws were passed in New York alone. These laws drastically increased safety regulations in factories in regards to fires and cleanliness. For example, factories were required to run fire drills, have automatic sprinklers, and have adequate fire escape and exits. There were also laws which dealt more with sanitary work environments and limitation on hours to work. New York also created a Bureau of Fire Prevention, clearly trying to avoid another catastrophic fire like the one witnessed recently.
These local reforms gained more traction quicker in New York due to the personal connection the public felt to the women who died during the fire, and their desire to ensure this never happened again. In just a few years, the New York legislature was able to transform how the labor system functioned and treated its workers better than the federal government was ever able to do. Soon after, other states saw the progress made in New York and followed in their footsteps in creating a better working environment for their laborers across the country.
Investigative journalism also contributed to the massive attention around the fire and was a major factor in creating changes. After the fire, investigative journalists started to use their writing in order to expose the truths of the issues such as the fire. News sources, such as the New York Times, published extensive articles after the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in order to inform the public on the extent of the catastrophe and the embedded issues within the factory system. The journalists used catchy headlines such as, "It was jump or be burned. They jumped. They crashed through broken glass. They crushed themselves to death on the sidewalk," to get people's attention and expose the depths of these issues. By doing this, they exposed to the public the terrible conditions of factories and spurred various reforms at the local level. In many ways, this was much more successful on the local levels than the policies of the Progressive era.
Of the Gilded Age, a period where business controlled both the economy and society. Businesses controlled the lives of their employees, demanding long hours for little pay, and would blacklist employees if they rebelled against the harsh conditions. In addition, companies forced laborers to sign yellow dog contracts, which disabled workers from joining unions or involving themselves with union-oriented ideas. Employees were forced to live with these terrible conditions or have no food to put on their tables. Evidently, at this point, big business had almost complete control of the lives of the working class, as government did little to regulate or provide relief for the laborer. The link between the actions of the owners and local government and the magnitude of the tragedy was not lost on the workers either. In fact, many of those who were there and those who lost loved ones blamed the profit-driven owners of the Triangle Shirtwaist Company for the deaths. Max Hochfield, a survivor of the fire, lost his sister to the tragedy when he was stopped from going back up the stairs to look for her. The event had a great toll on him, and he felt motivated to avenge her death. "I began to plan how to get a gun," he says. "I would go to collect the wages they owed me and my sister. The bosses would be there. I would come in and ask for the money. I would kill them." The only thing that stopped him from carrying out this plan was that he had no money in his pocket. This event clearly had a devastating effect on all those involved, and it also pitted those not already against the owners and city inspection committees strongly against them.
The Gilded Age era also witnessed a massive period of immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, also known as the Second Wave of Immigration. Thousands of immigrants were coming into New York City, escaping the harsh economic and religious climates of their home countries. These immigrants usually ended up in the Lower East Side, as they formed ethnic communities based off their culture. These people would then be forced into the labor system of the city, as racism and other cultural limitations prevented them from working elsewhere. They would then be exposed to the harsh conditions of factory life, and be forced to work long hours in exchange for little pay. Within the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, the large majority of workers were struggling immigrants. These immigrants were guaranteed zero rights both within the workplace and within New York society in general. In response, most immigrants joined unions such as the International Ladies Garment Association or the Knights of Labor. These unions gave workers both a sense of protection and hope, but unions faced limited success, especially leading up to the fire. Eventually, the activism and desires of the unions were heard as American society adapted a more progressive dynamic.
Clara Lemaitre's story is a classic example of an immigrant arriving in New York at the beginning of the 1900s. Clara arrived to America in 1905 as an immigrant coming from Ukraine. Clara ended up in the Lower East Side, where she entered the workforce as a garment worker in the factories. Clara soon developed the ideas of an urban progressive, as she was highly disturbed by the brutal and inhumane conditions of her workplace. She became involved with several unions, including the International Ladies Garment Association. Clara was famous for leading the uprising of 20,000, also known as the New York Shirtwaist Strike, in 1909. During the strike, 30,000 to 40,000 women, mostly Jewish, walked off their jobs for several weeks, demanding safer conditions, shorter hours, and higher wages. The strike set off a wave of labor strikes around the country in cities like Philadelphia, Cleveland, and Chicago. The strike was met with limited success, as business owners forcefully resisted the brave women's actions. Unfortunately, Clara's strike and general activism caused her to be blacklisted from most garment factories, and she was even attacked many times on the streets by various thugs. Clara received intense pushback for both her labor activism and strong feminist ideals. Despite this, Clara continued to be an activist along with thousands of other immigrants, and this led to a tension that spurred various reforms. The power of unions in the immigrant population was truly a major factor in provoking change, rather than federal policies.
Overall, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire and societal response led to effective changes that increased the rights of the laborer and created a more balanced and fair society. Through various reforms, the fire led to a stronger sense of awareness of the issues within the factories and the desperate need for labor reform. It is unfortunate that it was tragedy that inspired this, but it served as a powerful wake-up call for the continued corrupt government systems in the cities. The federal policies of the progressive era only extended so far locally, and at some point it was the culture that needed to be changed.